How to draw alpha-glucose. This will be our focus for our video for today. So before we begin learning how to do the drawing, let's learn why the heck we care about alpha-glucose. Alpha-glucose is a type of carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are organic molecules made of sugars and their polymers. Polymers are large molecules, and they are made of monomers, or single building block units. In this case, carbohydrate monomers are called simple sugars or monosaccharides. Mono meaning single, saccharide meaning sugar. The three key examples that are relevant for today are glucose, galactose, and fructose. They are all isomers of each other, which means that they have the same molecular formula, C6H12O6, but the way those carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens are bound to each other, they form different molecules that carry out different functions. So again, our monosaccharides are single sugars. They do have the empirical formula CH2O, so there's 5 carbon sugars like ribose that have 5 carbons, 10 hydrogens, and 5 oxygens. And then there are 6 carbon molecules, monosaccharides like glucose and fructose, that would be C6H12O6. Now, how do we produce glucose? Primarily, it's initially produced by the process of photosynthesis by plants. Plants require carbon dioxide, light to provide the energy, and water. And with the oxygens and the carbons and the oxygens, the hydrogens and the oxygens, we can rearrange those to produce the products of photosynthesis, which are sugars, or glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen gas, which we rely on. Plants are not the only organisms on the planet that do photosynthesis. Autotrophs, or organisms that do photosynthesis, also include some algae, like green algae, and there are also some bacteria that do photosynthesis also. Now, glucose can be used to build more complex structures like proteins and lipids and nucleic acids, but you start with the beginning, making the initial organic molecules of glucose through the process of photosynthesis with the majority of life forms. The characteristics of glucose are that they are a key energy source for life, especially glucose. So our cells, whether we're talking plant cells or animal cells, or fungal cells for that matter, you use glucose, you break it down, you break the bonds, and you get the energy out to run the metabolic processes of life. It can also use the carbons and hydrogens and oxygens in C6H12O6 to help build the organism and repair the organism. So you can break the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens apart and build more complex structures, from cell walls to proteins to DNA, etc., etc. Now here we see 3 classic monosaccharides. The one we will be focusing on today is glucose, and it's used for energy production in animals. It's slightly odd wording, but we'll keep it. So, for example, when you eat a potato, your digestive system breaks down the starch, which is many glucose molecules bound together, and then you transport that through your bloodstream after it's been absorbed out of your digestive system into your bloodstream, the glucose molecules, and then it gets taken into all of your cells, and then your cells break down the glucose and breaking the bonds. Usually your mitochondria are the main organelles involved in this, and you break the bonds and release the energy to run the metabolic processes of life. There's also galactose, which when you bind it with glucose, you can make the disaccharide lactose, which is milk sugar. When you bind glucose with fructose, you make the disaccharide sucrose, otherwise known as table sugar. And we can see here 3 shorthand ways of writing out these molecules. You can see that they are ring-shaped. You might have run across the linear way to write out glucose and fructose before your freshman year, but they actually form a ring shape when they're in an aqueous or water-based environment, and your cells are a water-based environment, plant cells are a water-based environment, organisms are pretty much mostly water, therefore these molecules primarily exist in a ring shape. Now there are certain things that are not written using this notation because it is assumed that you understand certain things behind it. So before you get to write like this, you have to learn the basics of how do you write it absolutely explicitly. So now we finally are at how to draw alpha-glucose. Now, alpha-glucose is a wonderful molecule for those of you who like breads and starchy foods like potatoes and rice, because It is, if you, again, here we have starch, many alpha glucose molecules bound together, and your digestive system can break them apart and absorb them. And then when it's absorbed into your bloodstream, we call it blood sugar. But then your cells take in the alpha glucose and use it as a key energy source when they break apart and rip apart the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. There are other types of glucoses called beta glucose, but those are not found in starch. Plants, for example, have linked together C6H12O6 and form a ring. That is a glucose molecule, but a slightly different configuration. And it's just different enough that your digestive system can't break it down. It is the primary component of plant cell walls. And so it is what we consider roughage or fiber in our diet when you're eating fresh fruits and vegetables. But that is not our concern for today. We don't want to focus on how do you draw a beta glucose. We want to focus on how do you draw alpha glucose. So let's look at how we draw alpha glucose. So again, we have C6H12O6. That is 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. But we can't just draw them in any which way we want. So let's start off with the carbons. So carbon, 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 carbon. Now you might think we put a carbon here to 6 to make a ring, but actually the carbon goes up here and an oxygen goes there. Now let's carefully link these together to make our basic ring structure. Now if you like to draw kind of in 3D, you can actually make these ones right here look a little thicker so that makes the ring look like it's popping out at you. This is not required, but it does make it a little easier to look at. Okay, so I'm going to write numbers next to the carbons, and this is how we determine this is carbon 1, carbon 2, carbon 3. And it's according to agreement in organic chemistry naming and numbering. So this would be carbon 1, the one closest to the oxygen, but not parting the carbon branching off. Carbon 2, carbon 3, carbon 4, carbon 5, carbon 6. So we have now numbered our carbons so we can keep track of them. And now there's a simple little thing you can keep track of. If you're going to draw alpha glucose, you just remember down, down, up, down, up. And that will ensure that you draw alpha glucose correctly. And what we're talking about here are the hydroxide groups, or OH. Now, this isn't some weird fancy element you've not heard of before. It's a functional group. So it is an oxygen bound onto a hydrogen, and then the oxygen has one other covalent bonding site, which will hold on to the carbon in the carbon ring. So down, down, up, down. Oh, look, I wrote HO instead of OH because we have to make sure that the oxygen and the carbon are bound together. Hydrogen can only have one covalent bond, and that one covalent bond is holding on to the oxygen, not to the hydrogen. So down, down, up, down. The final one is up here on the carbon 6. And you're like, what about lonely carbon 5? Well, carbon 5 just gets a hydrogen. That's all it gets. So you'll notice that this carbon has 1, 2, 3 covalent bonds, but carbon actually needs 4 covalent bonds to complete its valence electron shell. And that's where the rest of the hydrogens come into play. So now we go throughout the molecule and fill in the rest of the hydrogens. So every carbon has 4 covalent bonds, and therefore a completed valence electron shell. And there we have our alpha glucose. If you don't believe me, let's go through and count them off. So we already know we have 6 carbons because we counted those in the beginning and numbered them. So that's good. Let's look at our oxygens. Do we have 6 oxygens? 1 oxygen, 2 oxygen, 3 oxygen, 4 oxygen, 5 oxygen, 6 oxygen. We're good on oxygens. Now let's verify our hydrogens. We need 12 hydrogens. 1 hydrogen, 2 hydrogens, 3 hydrogens, 4 hydrogens, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Uh-oh, where's the 12th one go? This is the one that's I most commonly leave off when I'm getting lazy. and that is the carbon on the hydrogen that goes on carbon 5. And now we see that carbon 5 has 1, 2, 3, 4 covalent bonds, and therefore that carbon is complete. And that is how you draw alpha glucose. And if you go back here, this is later on, once you become a more mature biochemist student or organic chemist student, you can draw it more simply like that. But until then, be explicit, draw everything out.